Morning, everybody. It's not morning anymore, is it? Sorry about that. I just got done teaching, so. In any case, I want to introduce our speaker today as part of our History Distinguished Speaker Series. Very honored to have this individual with us today, both professionally and personally. Very, very pleased. Dr. Dionisio Valdez is earned a PhD from the University of Michigan. And he concentrated his efforts on labor and working class history. Later went on to become a professor of history at the University of Minnesota. Later on, he became part of the faculty at my alma mater, Michigan State. And I didn't know this until I picked him up at DFW Airport the other day, but he used to teach 6th grade. You can imagine that. Now, that's really brave. If you're going into education, believe me, it takes a lot of nerve. Dr. Valdez is one of the foremost historians on Chicano workers in the United States, especially when it comes to concentrating them outside of the traditional Southwestern context. Much of his focus, not exclusively, but much of his focus is in the Midwest in places like Michigan, Minnesota, and elsewhere. Some of his more impressive publications include El Norte, which is a history of agricultural workers throughout the Midwest in the early 20th century. Barrios Norteños, a social history, social labor, and cultural history of Mexicanos and the community that they forged in San Pablo or St. Paul. Most recently, he's published a comparative history, organized agriculture and the labor movement before the United Farm Workers Union that focuses on agricultural laborers in the context of Hawaii, California, and Puerto Rico. Enough of that. Not to say that that's not a remarkable accomplishment. It is. It's very, very impressive. But as I insinuated before I began, I have a personal connection to Dr. Valdez, and that connection is that he was once upon a time a member of my dissertation committee. So everything that you see right here, you can thank this guy. As I was saying, Dr. Valdez has made huge contributions when it comes to the field of working class history. And actually, I would say, as a labor historian, changed the way that some scholars of this variety look at the history of the labor movement. But what really distinguishes him, as you're going to find out here in a moment, is his abilities in the classroom as a teacher. So let me share a personal story with you. I'm not going to take up too much time because I want him to have plenty of time to go through his talk. In the spring of 2004, I think the best word that could be used to describe me as a graduate student with one semester under my belt was depressed. I was a depressed graduate student, and I was in the process of looking at what classes I wanted to take for the upcoming spring semester. And my advisor, who's another wonderful labor historian, said, "Take Valdez's class. He's a labor historian. You'll love him," right? And so I do. I go ahead and I sign up for that class. And on the first day of class, I kind of came to the conclusion very, very quickly that this was not going to be your prototypical run-of-the-mill labor history boring seminar. Smaller class, which is always nice. He taught us important historical methods, encouraged us to be very critical about the course material. One of my favorites, connected the world around us to what we were studying in class. But most importantly, what he did, and that I'm very grateful for, is challenged our abilities as emerging historians. It was in his comparative labor history seminar that I went on my first ever research trip. I traveled the 93 miles between East Lansing and Detroit, and I wound up at the Burton Historical Collection. And it was through his encouragement that I learned to ply my trade. I still use some of those connections that I made over there at the Burton, and some of the things that I learned how to do when it comes to getting there and digging as far as research is concerned. I guess what I'm trying to say is I'm very grateful for the work that he's put into my career as a historian. I've learned so much from him, and that's why I'm so happy to have him with you all here today so that we can share his knowledge and his expertise. So please, without further ado, please help us give a warm Mountain View welcome to Dr. Dionisio Valdez.
Thank you. Is this on? Can you hear me? Okay, fine. there's no echo. I guess the technology has improved since my earlier days there. Dr. Pettengill and I have a connection also that you might not know about, but Michigan State in the colloquium is known as MUU. It is a pleasure to be here. Thank you everyone for your presence. In today's talk, I want to talk about a topic that really didn't exist even a few years ago. Ultimately, I have done labor history and farm workers, I guess, across the country. And at the time that I started my work, there used to be dairy farms, and white farm families did all the work. That has changed almost in an instant. That is, in a course of about 10 years, the concentrated agricultural food operation was created. That is basically agribusiness hit it on the head, and that is ultimately what I want to talk about, but in a longer context. Again, I am glad many of you are history students. A few of you are probably history majors. And specifically, I want to talk about the commodity as one of the themes of what is at the heart of our conversation. That is, as you think about what is capitalism, that is, we all live under capitalism, but capitalism is trying to make things into commodities so they can be sold and then people make profits from them. It's rather simple. In the United States of America, and I think the Southwest especially, we think a lot about, well, this is the land of rugged individualism where you've got these really tough guys who are a success because they work really hard and more or less screw the government. So the most recent iteration of that is privatization. The government's no good, so get the government out. If we look at a history of what happens, and again, I want to look at milk and examine it, we find the story is a lot more complicated. And Bossy the cow, should call her Bossy Vaca, because she is Bossy the cow, that's our Bossy, is at the center of understanding the process of commodification, along with many other things, that is, that we want to look at. That is, how did it happen? How did milk itself become commodified? And what did that mean for people's daily lives? That is, how did it affect our working lives, those of us who produced milk, those of us who drank milk, what were human relations like? And also, how did that affect the land and the environment? The story is really fascinating, I think, here in particular. I'm really glad to be at Dallas because Dallas is the home of Dean Foods, which is the nation's largest food producer, and for a while, yes? Stand here? Sure. Dean Foods owned Horizon and Organic Valley and promoted the image of Bossy the cow. That is, Bossy happily ensconced in her farm, eating food in a real pleasant pasture, spending her evenings and wintertime in a fun barn, and everybody drinking the great healthy milk that we get for free in the schools, or at least very cheap if we're rich enough. And the myth of the Bossy the cow is one of the things I think that is still alive and well. And being that we're in the land of Dean Foods, some of you have probably had access to a few of these projects in your day. Dairy Pier, everybody had any of them? Okay, Pier Moo, Friendlies, Dean's, Mayfield, Altadena, Land O'Lakes are all companies that Dean controls. And Dean has basically about 35 to 40% of milk production in the United States today. So again, I'm really happy to be there. And they had Horizon Organic Foods for about a decade between 2004 and 2013, and then they broke off. So again, we're at the heart of where one of the the most important iteration, I guess we can say, of commodity capitalism in pertaining to milk exists. So again, Dallas is #1 here. Now, in my talk, I'd like to go over history and look at how the production of milk changed over time and how it became so important. It hasn't always been what it is now. I think that's probably the critical part of our story here. Okay, when we look at the very beginning of the story, and again, the first phase that I want to talk about, and there is really very interesting story of how it unfolds. The conquista of the Españoles in the 17th century, and Texas in the 18th century, and Alta California later in the 18th century, brought the first ruminants that people had domesticated here. Before that time, everybody, if our parents and our ancestors are native peoples, if we're from Mexico, there was no milk in our diet until that happened. And with the conquista, goats came, cows came, and other ruminants. But again, I want to focus on goats and cows because in the first phase of the history of milk, people barely drank cow's milk, they drank goat's milk. And goat was kind of interesting in its own reality, because from that time that the first goats came to the Americas, and they came to Nuevo Mexico right at the beginning of the 17th century, that is just in the very early 1600s, the culture of very rural people included goats and goat milk as a very minor but a significant part of their diets and a significant part of their lives. And that lasted really up until Baie was born in the beginning of the 20th century. So you've got 300 years. Most of our recent historical past, again, depending on how far you go back, if people had milk products, they had goat milk products. The cow was an import from Europe, and Europeans drank a lot of cow milk, but other people didn't drink cow milk. Cows were around, but mostly they were for leather, they were for hides, people's shoes, clothing. Sometimes people used them for other purposes. But basically the goat was where the action was. And the story of the, can you hear me when I'm here? I don't hear the echo, so I just want to make sure that's going on. That if we look at the process of work, what is going on in effect is, again, in this very small part, and for a long time, I guess the very small part of the economy, women are milking goats, and young boys, people who would roughly be middle school age now, they didn't go to school back then, they herded the goats. And there was an organization to life much unlike the farms and very much unlike the concentrated food operations of the present. And so you have, again, a much different way that work was done. It wasn't terribly complicated. Boys would go out in the daytime. There'd be near their homes. They'd have little stalls, basically little sheds for the animals, and then they'd send them out in the day and they'd move on to the commons. And I'd like to explain a little bit how that worked. Has anybody ever heard of acequias? They're basically irrigation canals. And in arid places, including Texas, in days like that aren't today, sometimes it gets really dry. And in the place where, or the places where people lived up until the 19th century, that was a much more arid part of the state than it is up here. And it was necessary to have irrigation to have agriculture. And so near people's houses, people would live near rivers, they'd live near streams and creeks, And from there, they would design irrigation ditches, which I'd like to explain a little bit, because that was on the center of their lives. So we've got an acequia, and the houses are near there, and the small fields are quite close. Here, I want to emphasize, anybody ever been to the San Antonio Missions National Historical Park? Okay, there's an acequia running around it. The people who lived there farmed by acequia agriculture, and that was the source of almost every bit of their food. If you look at it in a little more complicated way, you will note that it was much more widespread than we can believe. Has anybody ever been to Brackenridge Park in San Antonio? Okay. Brackenridge Park, they have just recently found, and these were archaeologists digging up, that there are acequias in there. Acequia agriculture extended that far, probably San Pedro Park. I know there's a little acequia there that I said, that's got to be one. And they're finding it now recently that that is the basis of agriculture. So Mexicanos in California and Texas, Nuevo Mexico, where most of them lived up until the middle of the 19th century, were small farmers producing for themselves, irrigating agriculture, and so they had to take care of it, and life was organized around that. And here in the Taos Valley, I hope I can emphasize, if you look at all the networks, these are the rivers that are up there, and as you follow, let's see if this works, yeah. The little village is the place where people lived, were right along the rivers. I'll show it a little more in a couple of the other places. A schematic rendering indicates, okay, and again, how many of you have been to Nuevo Mexico? Know it a little bit at least. Okay, usually you're in a valley, and especially the Rio Grande, the same Rio Grande that goes down to Matamoros and Brownsville, higher up, it is mountainous, and on the side, you have hills, and then where the streams are, you'll have acequias, and the town is real close to the stream. That is, there's an acequia here, here's a stream coming from the mountain or the river, and then another on the other side. The houses, the little village, is located right next to the river, and you have small garden plots here, and larger fields will be out here, and the rest of the land is a commons. And probably, if you look at the ecological zone of a life in production, this is a community land grant as well, and it covers the entire area here. So this is basically the center of people's lives. They live in the little village. The little boys, who are the shepherds, will go into the commons to graze the herd, and at night they come back home. Mom will milk goats, take care of it, and there'll be somewhere in the heart of the town a little plaza where people trade and they share their goods with each other. And that's basically the center of life. If there is a highway here, once in a while, up until about 1820 or 1830, once or twice a year, there would be some trade with Mexico. And not food, but metal goods might be traded, a few other very basics that could last 6 months or 8 months, certainly not any food, would be at the center of this production. But otherwise, this is what life is, and this is all there is to it. And in this regard, if you look here, there's not a lot of animals. Overwhelmingly, up until the turn of the 20th century, and you can go into a lot of small towns in Mexico now, the same thing applies, people almost eat no meat. And it's shocking to see the observations when, after the 1840s, when the conquest came from the United States, with few exceptions, there are comments, Mexicans don't eat any meat. Or they eat very little meat. They might eat some, of course, if they're gonna, it's gonna be, they'll use ajo, they'll use chile peppers to season it, but otherwise, mostly people are vegetarians. They'll eat a little bit of goat milk, especially kids. They might eat a little bit of cheese that mom will make. It'll be queso blanco because it's really easy to make, but otherwise, people aren't eating a lot of meat. And that, again, is the story of our lives, at least until Baie comes around. That is up until the turn of the 20th century, and it continues in Mexico. So this is the way life is for us up until that time. We can look at Santa Fe, again, the big town, the capital. And if you look at it, Here's an acequia coming right through town. You see the little houses along there. Here's the plaza. This is where the trading will take place. This is 1766. Look at how much bigger it is 80 years later, 1846. This is the year of the invasion. That was when they came in and they conquered it. And again, you can still see the fields. You can see the heart of the action. And people are living mostly right along here, little houses right along the river. But this is a series of canals. Here, here, here. And it's basically a network of agriculture. So everybody has farms. Now, what is interesting, and one argument I want to make that is quite strong, is that the vast majority of the Mexicanos of 1846 in Nuevo Mexico, in 1820 in Texas, in 1810, 1820 in California, owned land. They were small farmers, poor but self-sufficient. The vast majority of the food that they ate, they produced themselves. And it was only with the invasion from the United States that changed. And the Santa Fe Trail, for those of you who might have followed Professor Pettengill, I don't know if you talked about that in your history classes, but it started only in the 1820s, so the first contact with the United States systematically came with the Santa Fe Trail. It came from St. Louis, Missouri to Santa Fe, and it went ultimately down into Chihuahua and out to Mexico, to Mexico City. And some goods came. They were not food goods. First thing people started changing in their commodification, I guess, of their lives was their clothes. That is, people started wearing cotton goods. The Industrial Revolution was taking off in the United States, and they started wearing the goods that were made in the factories that the women and later on the men of places farther east, at the time largely New England, later on other places farther west, would bring in. And so people were starting to wear the other clothes that were brought in. Now it's interesting that the small farmers of the little villages in Nuevo Mexico at the time, in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, would bring in some goods to trade. You see some small vendors in many of the sketches around that are selling goods around the little things that they have basically as their access. But they basically don't live under commodity capitalism. You can say, yes, to a degree, there are things that are sold. The commodity capitalism was around for a long, long time, but it didn't penetrate very deeply. It has, over time, gotten more and more and more deep. It's gotten more and more a part of our lives. And on the Santa Fe Plaza, you'll still see, as late as the 1880s or so, a lot of little kids wearing homespun, wearing all their little goods, and they're coming in to sell things. This is basically the middle class. These are the people who later on joined the GI Forum and the LULACs and things like that. They're the first people, the middle class people, who wear the goods that the traders from the United States come to sell because they have more money, they have more access, and they're exploiting people a bit. So the plaza is an interesting place to see changes in social life over time. And again, there's more trading, there's more goods, little general stores are set up, and that is where the commodity production becomes more and more intense through the course of time. But we can clearly say, as late as 1900, Mexicanos in the Southwest were not drinking cow's milk. Very few exceptions. And the modern milking operation did not exist very much in the Southwest. There were a few people, European immigrants who brought the European machinery later on, developed in the United States. Later on, you'll see, they're the ones who are going to be bringing in the technology and the development that makes Baie possible. And modernization in the Southwest basically dates from approximately the turn of the 20th century, 1900, 1910, at which time we see some of the earliest tools that are characteristic of 100 years ago when the first machines are around. Glasses, buckets, bottles, and look at the cows. These are the classic cows of 1900. Keep your eye on that, please, because you'll see 100 years later, cows don't look the same. Even the cow is different. Whether Baie is happy about it or not, we're not sure. But again, things have changed, and they've changed quite profoundly. Now, the modernization and the commodification of milk has two really very important components to it that challenge the whole idea of rugged individualism. That is, first of all, scientists developed scientific methods, as they called it, for production. And tools came about, mechanical tools. It wasn't just the Industrial Revolution, but it was specifically applying it in a way that changed production in various areas. And if we look at the earliest milker, this Meyering milker was perfected in Germany and brought over to the United States. Other more complicated ones came about. Now, what's the difference between this and a lady with a milking bucket? 2 cows. There was 1 cow before. Second thing that's really quite critical about it, once the machine comes in, it's okay for the guy to milk the cow. So you got a really profound change. Men are willing to do a job they wouldn't humble themselves before, to milk a cow. And it's really a very profound change also because, as we'll note later on, many other aspects of social life of the productive process change with this possibility that was encouraged by making milking machines. And so scientists, developers, not surprisingly, the vast majority of them, hired by colleges and universities, did the work to make rugged individualism on the farm possible. The de Laval pump is a very important one because later on we'll see a story, and keep your eye open because it's one of the first automatic milking machines that comes from the, I guess, post-CAFO period. But we can say this is basically a milking parlor from almost anywhere in the United States, including anywhere in the Southwest. That is, you have a barn, you got a stall, a few cows. The farmer is taking, as he milks the cow from the pail, he'll pour it in the bucket, a 10-gallon can, take that, put it in his truck, and drive it over to the creamery. And that's pretty much the process of labor, but the man is now in the barn, milking Baie, the commercial cow. Now, it's significant, I think I want to emphasize this point, that as part of the production, it's important to make a number of other changes also, one of which is to convince people to drink milk. Mostly kids drank milk, and mostly kids drank mama's milk. Why should we drink cow's milk? That's a good question, I think. Cow's milk is not mama's milk. Mama's a lot more friendly and a lot warmer, and also, you know, you've got direct access. You don't have all these intermediaries. Well, we can thank the United States Department of Agriculture for that, and the United States government. So rugged individualism is not possible without the US government. These are all USDA ads. This one, little children need food between meals. So we're moving up from the infants to kids. Kids who are 6, 8, 10 years old. They need milk. Not only milk, cottage cheese. This is another, again, USDA advertisement from the 1920s. More milk products convince you, create a need. The Bureau of Home Economics. In my generation, I remember there were classes that girls took mostly called home economics, and most of their educational materials, as they called them, were produced by Home Economics, the USDA Bureau of Home Economics. And they're identifying again, like the other people doing ads, that milk is natural. That milk is one of nature's foods. And it's the best thing you can drink. It's the magic food. And you hear that time and time and time again, that milk is so important. Now, you probably remember the milk mustaches, most of you in the ads. Okay, well, a lot of the people in the milk ads were baseball stars and football stars and professional sports heroes. Anybody remember Walter Johnson? He was from the first group of 5 who were inducted into the Hall of Fame as a pitcher. And he was the greatest pitcher of his era from the Washington Senators and Washington Nationals. The greatest pitcher, the first pitcher inducted into the Baseball Hall of Fame. He's advertising for milk at Yankee Stadium in 1925. Thank you, United States Department of Agriculture. You find a hero, a baseball hero. All the kids want to play baseball. I want to be like Walter Johnson. I want to throw the fastest. He had the fastest fastball of anybody. I want to throw a fast fastball. Mommy, dame leche. Give me some milk. Creating a need, nature's lift. And right here, the bottom line, you never outgrow your need for milk. Who doesn't remember that from my generation? Even some from you, right? But the USDA and the advertisers by the 1940s and 50s are not saying simply milk is for children, but adults need milk. They're creating a need. You need milk. If you don't, you're going to have all these problems. Besides, milk is natural, milk is good for you, and milk makes you happy. Now, with the advertising and the research, now you can create the dairy farmer. And the dairy farmer of the West is made possible by the irrigation projects that the United States government funded in arid locations throughout the Southwest. And the place that I'm doing most of my work in, and I want to say that's partly why I'm focusing on the Southwest, but specifically in the Mesilla Valley and the El Paso Valley, running straight north from El Paso into Las Cruces and farther north, the Elephant Butte project was established. And the work on the Elephant Butte project dates pretty much, that is the construction process, from about 1905 up until about 1916 when they first started selling lands. What's interesting is once the project was in place, the government realized that to make this successful, to make commercial agriculture successful in the Southwest, they needed farmers. And so they advertised for farmers all over the place. They had brochures, they did it in newspapers, they did all kinds of things, but they also established land offices. So some guy doesn't have a job, he's coming out west from Kentucky, or he's coming out from Missouri or New York or wherever else he's coming from. He says, God, what can I do? And he sees the American Rio Grande and Irrigation Company. And he goes in, hey, what's going on here, brother? Guy says, hey, you want some land? We'll make a deal with you. If you promise to work this land, it will be paid off in 20 years. 0 down. Most of the first farmers coming into the irrigation project in Nuevo Mexico at the Elephant Butte didn't have very many resources. They were very poor. They weren't born in Nuevo Mexico. A few of them were, but the vast majority came from somewhere else. They didn't have a lot of resources. They didn't certainly have enough money to buy land, but they were lured into becoming farmers. And those were the first dairy farmers in commercial agriculture in the entire Southwest. There wasn't much before. As late as 1917 in Nuevo Mexico, for example, 3/4 of the butter was imported from other places because it wasn't established. Now, when the farmer, the other part of the story of the farmer is that they would send their milk to the creamery, and the creamery would separate the cream and the milk, and they'd also ship it out to all your locations. This was the largest creamery in Nuevo Mexico at the end of the 1930s. Now, again, this is basically the life of the dairy farmer and the life of the consumer. They're shipping things not in great distance, but what's most interesting is that you have a dairy farm family that's doing all the production. Men are doing a lot of the work. Women, of course, are busy working on their labor-saving devices, sending kids to school. Kids can't work on the farm very much anymore, and certainly the Mexicanos are even forced to go to school. That is, by the 20th century, the government is compelling the youngsters of Nuevo Mexico, it's still mostly Mexicanos at the time, to go to school. They didn't care before when it was a colony, but once it's a state, they say, oh, well, you can go to school. And what do they learn at school? You never outgrow your need for milk that they had never drank before. But it's subsidized and it's free. So, hey, that milk is pretty good. So I'm happy about it. Now, we can turn to the most recent period, that is the contemporary CAFO, and say that that model basically starts to break down in the 1960s and 70s of the family dairy farmer as there is an effort. And this is a real interesting struggle that producers have, and I guess we can say it's almost everywhere you have commodities. You're encouraged to produce as much as you can, and you automatically overproduce. So you got a surplus. It's a vicious cycle. And one of the things that you do when you have a vicious cycle is you turn to the government to advertise to get you to sell more. You also get the government to create new products. And if you note in this period, and this graph, I don't think you can see it very well. This is 1970, this is 2010. You'll see milk production isn't in here because it kind of levels out, it goes kind of slow, but some other products, yogurt goes up, but the big one that goes up is cheese. Cheese production approximately quadruples in that period. People are eating a lot more cheese in your lifetimes, your parents' lifetimes pretty much. And what do we know about cheese? We know a lot of things about cheese, but one of them is it has an effect on your panza. There's no doubt about that. So again, we'll get into that a little bit as we look at the contemporary period. Now, the federal government is involved in expanding the consumption of cheese to traditionally non-cheese drinking populations. They're the ones that Professor Pettengill might call the other people, right? But the other people have one very critical characteristic that Europeans don't have. Most of us are lactose intolerant, meaning it causes problems. We can get constipation, we can get irritation, other things happen. In extreme cases, it'll make us really sick and it could cause a lot of problems. So what happens is the promotion by the USDA is, as it advances the milk mustache, as it advances other things, it gets people like Spike Lee to wear a milk mustache to convince a population, African Americans, 90% milk intolerant. That means only about 10% of people can drink milk without some kind of after effects. But if it's good for Spike Lee, then hey, it's good for my kids. Now, Mexicans and other Latinos prefer Supermama porque es rubia. And it's got to be a blonde. You don't even have in those ads. You're not even going to have a morena. You're not going to have a regular Mexican. You got to have the one here. And Supermama has a mustache too because that ad makes Daddy happy. Because he says, yeah, rubia, that's what I got my eye on. And the advertising goes to populations that shouldn't be drinking milk. So what's our government doing? It's a good question, and I think it's a fair one to ask. Now, along with the advertising by the government, along with the changes in the desire to get more people to produce milk, you eliminate the pasture. Cows rarely pasture anymore anywhere in the United States. Pasture takes a lot of work because somebody has to take the cows out to the pasture, somebody has to bring them back. And notably, with gigantic herds, it becomes really, really complicated. So instead, you just set up a feedlot, and the cow spends their entire life, sometimes under a cover, sometimes like that. But that's where they spend their whole life, in a feedlot, before they are brought into the parlor and the end of the barn, except on the ad. If you buy Horizon Organic Milk, you'll see the milk on the cover of your milk carton and a lot of the other cartons in the same way. And the operations literally are very huge. Currently, and again compared to the average dairy farm of say 1960, even as late as 1960, the 1960s, the average farm in the United States that had dairies, which was a mixed operation, the family would produce not only milk, they'd produce the hay, maybe the alfalfa, other grasses for the cow to eat. They might grow some wheat and other things, partly for their own consumption, partly for something else, but they usually had a garden. And a lot of the time they had the orchard. So some of the aspects of the old production of the goat, where people would eat a lot of their own food, was still around. That was part of the dairy farmer model. It's changed a little bit, and again, I'll get into that a little in just a second or two, but basically, again, with the outdoor feedlot, things are totally different. And from the 1960s, when you had about 40 cows in a single dairy operation, Nuevo Mexico now has the largest dairies in the United States of America. And in 2018, the average dairy has 2,500 cows. That's not very long. That's 50 years. 2,500 cows. How can Farmer Pete and his wife and a couple kids even manage any of that? Well, got to upend everything. You say, hey, there's a different way. And notions of profit and notions of what production should be like, and ultimately notions of what the commodity are all about, have basically been upended. Now, you need calves. And in the CAFO model, the Concentrated Agricultural Food Operation, there are two different kinds of calves. There are the male and the female. Female become heifers and cows. But the little baby male calves, most of the time, get slaughtered immediately and they become veal. Because nowadays, there's only one kind of cow that produces a lot of milk. They're the big Holsteins. Years ago, even 100 years ago, there were 15 different kinds of cows people got milk from in different parts of the country. The Holstein cow is a pretty big cow. It produces the most milk, but it produces really crummy, fancy cuts. So Black Angus is like the going part in that part of agribusiness. And the little baby Holsteins that are going to be growing up for milk are put into calf houses on the side of the operation. And again, it's industrial. It's the same kind of industry as everything else. Here's what's called a rotary milking parlor, which is really big. There's stalls to milk, 80 or 100 in this one instance. There's another model. It's the straight milking parlor. They used to have double 12s, which would mean there'd be 24 stalls to milk at a time, versus, again, the small dairy farm of the past. It's totally upended. And the milker has become, only since the 1980s, 1990s, in some cases when we go up to places like Maine, only around the year 2000 did the first Mexicanos start milking cows. But now throughout the country, 80% of approximately 150,000 dairy workers are Mexicanos. Almost all of them are undocumented, meaning what are their labor rights? Very few. What are their rights to complain? Very few. What are working conditions? Working conditions are a lot different than they were for migrant workers because this is stable work. And you can't create a gig economy when the cow has to be milked. So they put them on and they use the ideology, well, this is a farm and the farm can't shut down. Cows don't stop producing milk. So they work 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week. The law doesn't even require minimum wage for some of the places. And the law doesn't defend overtime if you work over 8 hours or over 40 hours in a week. So the operations are very profitable for everybody but the worker, and the worker does have a stable job. Now they live most of the time on the farm. So they're invisible, and I know Professor Pettengill was talking about segregation and things like that. This is the ultimate segregation. They never leave the farm. They have housing. They live in a shack or they live in a trailer, and they walk to work. So they're not making a big ecological impact, but who are they going to complain to? If they complain, they're out the door. As farmers repeatedly say, if you don't like it, don't let the door hit you. And that's basically the story. And so this is the modern operation. Now, there has been in the milking operation, in the milking parlor in particular, a profound change. As late as the 1960s, the vast majority of milking operations were conducted by a family. The dairy farm owner. The dairy farm owner typically worked by himself, possibly with adult children, sometimes with a hired hand or two, but rarely more than that. Now, I guess I hate to make a generalization because people haven't studied this enough and I'm not quite deep enough, but it seems like it's approximately 1 worker per 100 cows. Operations of 1,000 cows have about 10 hired workers. Operations of 2,000 have about 20. So you'll have a hierarchy within there. And at the very top are the farmers who survive. And 90% of the farmers have disappeared since the 1960s. Because the big operation takes everything, and all the other farmers, they sell their land, or they send it out. They send it out to pasture. But basically, again, the dairy operations are much different, and these operations don't even grow their own grass. That is, there are separate distinctions between those that grow for producing dairy, those that grow for alfalfa, corn, or other crops. And interestingly enough, the government is deeply involved in it. In most locations, the major food that cows eat will not be grasses. Corn, soy, and cottonseed. What do we know about those 3 crops? Those are the 3 largest genetically modified organisms that are produced in the United States. And most of that is produced for cows. It's not produced for us. The cows drink they eat 90% of it. And in order for that to survive, that is that operation of that GMO food, you need glyphosate, which is what Monsanto produces. You need other things around because you have to kill everything around to enable the genetically modified organism to grow. But that seeps into the corn, into the soy, and into the cottonseed, and ultimately into the cow, which means ultimately into our milk. So, milk is nature's favorite, but again, a few caveats, but you know, that's capitalism, right? Okay, now, what do you do in an operation where you have 2,500 cows? Well, a lot of things kind of get lost on the side. And one of the things, not only a justification for pasteurization, but in the case of other kinds of putting in medicines, hormones, and especially things to keep the cows healthy, they argue, well, let's just irradiate it because it kills everything. It even kills the mierda. We'd probably call it manure and other things in the operation. And at least, you know, we've got non-active manure in our milk. At least it's not going to kill us, but it doesn't add to the flavor. Now, ultimately, one of the worst features of the concentrated agricultural food operation is that it generates massive amounts of manure in concentrated forms. It's horrible. Old farms manure used to be kind of profitable because you could spread it around, you could use it in small amounts, but in such concentrations, it leaches. Not only does it cause stench, I have calculated, again, these are very rough estimates, that over the past decade, over 1,000 milk workers were killed on the job, skyrocketing, one of the most dangerous operations, and in contrast to so many other places where work is supposedly less dangerous, not on the milk operation, the worst place to die is in the manure pit. They die because of not only getting stuck in the manure, but especially because the smell is horrible and ammonia and many other fumes come up and people literally suffocate. Sorry to make it look bad. I was going to show some films on all that, but you know, it broke my heart, let alone, you know, imagine how you'd feel about it. But again, the manure pit is the ultimate story, I would argue, of the problem with a concentrated food producing operation. That is, it's not viable. And people around are upset about it. Now, in Elephant Butte Lake, I don't know if you know that little location, but they have a problem caused by concentrated agriculture, and particularly the cows, called algae bloom. It has done damage in Lake Erie, making it impossible for people to drink water for long periods of time because, again, it leaches into the soil. Ultimately, when it rains, it leaches into the lake, and everything around it is dead. It's creating a dead zone. And so that's kind of, you know, the unfortunate part of that story. And ultimately, I just want to suggest that as we look at the story of concentrated agriculture, that we have a cow who also suffers tremendously. And in the part of the story, our own health is endangered from all the problems that ensue. If you want to ask again, we're running kind of low. I'd like to save a little bit of time for the question and answer, and I can maybe talk about a few other things. But again, I don't want to end this story saying, you know, I don't want to put up with yours, but I know you don't want to put up with mine anymore either. So anyway, thank you.
Anyone have a question for the professor?
Any people from dairy families? Yes. Okay. A small dairy. Where and when? Can you tell us what it was like?
I'm old.
Yeah, we're curious though. I mean, what was that dairy like? What did your family grow? What did did you eat food from the farm?
A small farm, which my parents did not own.
Okay.
And so the dairy was the cash crop.
Yes.
Sold grade A milk.
Okay.
Milking maybe 15, 20 cows.
Okay.
A strictly single farm family
Yes.
operation. This was late 40s, 1950s, 60s. My brother continued until about 1982.
Okay.
The Department of Agriculture bought him out.
Okay.
Discouraged quality control milk production.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Excellent. So fits in perfectly with that model.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Right on.
Cool. Okay. Okay. Any other dairy families? Curious? Okay. So any other comments or questions? Anything anybody wants to talk about? Professor Pittengill?
It seems to me that you can't really go through the supermarket anymore. I'll give you a quick example. There was one, I was sent to the Super Target to get eggs. They didn't have one egg in their store. And I asked why. They said because we couldn't get them from cage-free farm, something like that.
Sure.
So it just seems to me like people are very conscious of this sort of conditions in which the food is produced nowadays, especially what they're putting into the bodies as far as nutrition. And we know, for those of us that have taken history for too, that the Women's Consumer League, whomever it was bringing attention that there were formaldehyde.
Sure. Right.
I mean, what kind of reaction, what kind of populist sort of pushback against big dairy are you seeing?
Sure. Okay, there's two levels here that I'd like to talk about. The first is organized labor, and basically organized labor is on its back. Not only did organized labor pretty much ignore farm workers, for the 100 years of the 20th century when it had some power, but it's really struggling. The UFW actually tried to organize in Washington. There was one dairy that they were active at. Now, there are worker centers also, and they're very important. Probably the most visible and the most exciting, again, on that level of people doing anything was in Vermont. One of the worker centers organized the workers of Ben & Jerry's, and again, they were able to target Ben & Jerry's. This was just last year. That is last fall. They made an agreement, and it was supposedly worker-driven because the workers were guaranteed a minimum wage. That they don't have to live in dangerous conditions, that they could complain to workers. So they're all excited because they're making minimum wage. And the worker centers are good because, again, organized labor can't do much. Now, what's really interesting, there was another struggle in New York State that was just resolved last year, too. And the New York State Constitution is very interesting because, unlike most other places, it says explicitly, and I can almost quote this, every person who works in the state of New York has the right to organize. This is 1938. So the worker center said, hey, let's take this up. And, this looks pretty clear to me. On its face, and this is as legal people talk, on its face, we can't lose. Well, how corrupt the courts are and how corrupt the judges are, and the decision that was made was, let's just throw it back to the legislature. So even on its face, when the law protects you, it doesn't. That's kind of the bottom line. It's kind of like the police brutality thing. You hear story after story after story. You go, I got a gun. What are you going to do? And, people can make stuff up, and, the interpreters of the law, as long as there isn't pushback, are really struggling. So on that level, I guess organized labor is down, but as long as it's not out, if there's a worker center, you got to fight with them. You got to support them. Now, the second side is interesting, and especially for those of you who think of yourself as consumers. There are organizations around where you can learn a lot more about it. And it's really fun to watch them. I mean, intellectually, and even if it hurts you or turns your stomach a little bit, there's notmilk.com, and that's, again, a play on got milk. Okay, so you can go on to Not Milk. There are two other organizations that are interesting, and I guess I want to protect myself. When I was 22 years old, I was going to college. I know some of you probably are pretty close to 22 right now. And one of my good friends had just come back from San Francisco up to Little Michigan, little town, not too far from where Professor Pettengill grew up, Saginaw County. And he said, they had these vegetarians over there. And it was kind of cool, way back, long, I was your age then. We made a $1 bet. Who could go without eating meat the longest? And I became a vegetarian, and I haven't had a chunk of beef or any meat or any fish or anything like that ever since. And I've been kind of wobbling on the dairy products. It's kind of hard when you live with people who, eat all the dairy products. But again, I've done vegan for a long time. And the two organizations I want to talk about are vegan. That is, one is called Mercy for Animals, and they're online. And if you want to see some horrible animal brutality, you can go there, but you also get some good educational material. The other one, of course, you've heard of is PETA, P-E-T-A. And they've been around for a long time, and they really get lambasted. And this is interesting, and I just want to answer your question or finish it on this part, that PETA are supposedly crazy and they're anarchists and everything else, but they do promote a really strong alternative. And that is that you have to go back to producing your own. And ultimately, I'm going to make that argument that one of the things that we can do is don't drink so much. Whether or not we're going to stop drinking milk totally, some people can handle it. Some people, hell, it's really easy. I know when I became a vegetarian, I felt so much healthier really, really quickly on many levels, but I could see specifically, like in the summer, el sudor, I almost stopped sweating compared to what it was. 90% of it just went down. It meant that wasn't good for my body. That was the message there. And if you want to test yourself on milk, and again, many of you people, I would imagine, without stereotyping, might be lactose intolerant, try it for a little while. There's almond milk and soy milk and flax milk and other things, and they might have some problems with them. Almond milk uses a lot of water. People get really upset about that. Cow's milk uses more. So, what's the deal here? Now, I like oat milk. It's not really popular, but that's probably ecologically one of the best, and it really tastes good. But again, there's a lot of alternatives. And to boycott milk and to try something else is really good. Now, if you really want to go off onto a commune or something like that, that really is the ideal. But, I'm not yet arguing that. I would argue that for the farm workers. I think they should all leave and go occupy Detroit because nobody's going to stop them. Land's cheap, excellent farming. That's why people from Europe came there first. Of all the places in the Midwest, they occupied Detroit because it was great farming. And there's vast tracts of land available for dirt cheap. So capitalism isn't going to stop them like they might if they tried to set something up in Austin. Any other comments or questions? Yes? Okay, that's an excellent question. I didn't say more regulation is necessarily good. I'm arguing that basically the government has become commodified. The rich have bought the government. And again, you can look across the board, it's not just milk. And again, the commodification story that I'm arguing here kind of applies a little more widely, but as long as the dairymen and the top of the dairy industry, Dean and all those control it all, they're going to make those decisions. And it's a lie that the government is not involved. That's the other part of the story. The government is very involved. But why isn't the government, and that's my question, why isn't the government concerned about its citizens? It's a government of, by, and for the people. It's not of, by, and for the profit interests of a few. Okay? Again, great question. Yeah?
There's still price supports for milk?
Yes. Different kinds. And again, now, just recently, and again, some of you probably know this better than I do because you've been around, strawberry milk and chocolate milk go into there. So, you know, kids are drinking the shit milk. You know, milk is bad enough, but then you put that in there and it's addictive too. So, you know, you say, hey, this is really good, I'm going to drink another one. And so, yeah, they've got all the milk products and they're tossing them. And this is really interesting. They're tossing all those products, cheese products and everything, into all the food that we make. They help, I mean, not only the direct price supports, they're there, but some of you might know some of these pizzas, and I just was going to talk about this, but I'm going to ask because this is a price support. This is a USDA program. In their dairy programs, the USDA helped Pizza Hut develop the Cheesy Bites pizza. Okay, you ever had any? Okay, Burger King, listen to this title, and again, you might have eaten one. You don't have to be embarrassed. The Cheese Angus Bacon Cheeseburger. This is a USDA, okay, love it. Okay, Domino's, the Wisconsin pizza has 6 cheeses on the topping, and it has 2 more cheeses in the crust. Thank you, USDA. Now, is that a price support? It sort of is, you know. Again, it's not direct, but you know, it's really crazy. And what do they care about us? You know, what do they care about our health, all the hormones, all that? They don't give a damn. You know, it's unfortunate. Okay, cool. Any more? Okay, I'd like to really thank you very much. You've been a great crowd, and hope to see you around, and stay in college and keep researching. Okay.